Although polarization is dangerous for democracy and often affects and shows up in our daily lives, there are institutional reforms that can help us grapple with the problem. So with that, thank you for giving me the chance to speak with you today, and I look forward to learning from your questions and to continuing the discussion. So with that, Michael, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. That was really a fantastic talk. I think I can speak for everyone when I say we've learned a lot. And so let's open the floor to questions. We got time for quite a few questions. So any ideas, any things you want to, yeah, go ahead. Sure. I'll give you the mic.
Well, first, thank you very much for this conference. You stated the example of Kenya, where they adopted a new constitution, where they gave more autonomy to local officials to battle polarization. Wouldn't that be a bandage rather than a cure, as we are leaving political division in different local areas, rather than opposing them in the public place as they maybe should be in a perfect democracy?
That is an extremely thoughtful question. Thank you for that. I think that actually one of the key lessons from the book is that it's actually the best that we can do often in democracy is to manage, or as you said very aptly, to bandage political divisions rather than to remove them or eradicate them entirely. So I think that your question really gets excellently to this point, is that often political institutional reforms can't change the fact that, for example, Kenya has ethnic divisions. There are different ethnic groups that have different interests, and they often compete with one another for resources. What political institutions can do is shape the intensity of that conflict. So the challenge with Kenya's previous political system was that immense power was concentrated in the office of the presidency. And that meant that whichever ethnic group got their candidate elected to the presidency effectively won a zero-sum competition for resources. That meant that competition for the presidency was fierce. So fierce, in fact, that after the 2007 Kenyan presidential election, there was ethnic violence and election violence that left more than 1,000 Kenyans dead. And politicians had really strong incentives to capture the presidency, to make sure they won it, so that all the national resources would be distributed to their particular group. Now, I agree, actually, that of course, the Kenyan decentralization reforms leave those ethnic divisions in place to a certain extent. And some people are critical of the fact, in fact, that these reforms have basically decentralized corruption. Because what's happened is that now provinces that are affiliated with the Kikuyu ethnic group have Kikuyu governors, and the Kikuyu governor of that group distributes the money to the ethnic group in their area. But there are also areas controlled by the Luo ethnic group that now have their own budget and can distribute the money to their own ethnic group. So I think that's exactly right and important, and contributes an important theoretical question, which is that for polarization, there is often not a single silver bullet. There is very rarely a reform that will convince people that they have identical interests or the same interests so that the division doesn't exist. Often the best that we can do through election reforms or political reforms is, as you said, apply a bandage and sort of try to manage the divisions that exist rather than eliminating those divisions. So thank you for that very thoughtful and I think insightful question.
Thank you. All right. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. So you talked about the research that showed that people who didn't have access to social media were less polarized. But how can we actually measure polarization in someone?
That's an excellent question as well. So the first thing I'll mention about that study that's extremely interesting and surprising is that actually there are some benefits to social media. So this study found that when you pay people to deactivate their social media accounts, actually there are some negative effects as well. And in particular, people become less politically informed just because they're reading less about the news that they were previously consuming on social media. Now, your specific question was, how do we measure political polarization and how do we quantitatively show that polarization has decreased? And here I think it's helpful that we've spent some time discussing how to define polarization. So one dimension of showing a reduction in polarization is to show that affective polarization has decreased. So the way that political scientists often do this, and you could do this if you were curious in your own life, either to measure polarization in yourself or maybe among your friends, is that respondents are basically given a scale from 0 to 100, and they're asked, how do you feel about Democrats on a scale from I hate them to I like them, 0 to 100? How do you feel about Republicans on a scale from 0 to 100? I hate them, I like them. And that measure of this, and there are other questions that political scientists ask as well, like, would you feel comfortable if your child married someone who votes for the other party? Would you feel comfortable dating someone who votes for the other party? And what the scholars, and of course, as I mentioned as well, there's measures of ideological polarization as well, how intensely people are gravitating towards the extremes in ideological issues. So what was interesting about this polarization study is that they found that after paying some people to deactivate their Facebook, those people became less affectively and ideologically polarized over time, according to the questions I mentioned, as compared to the people who continued using their Facebook, continued as effectively as normal. So that would sort of been the control group. So I think also what this illustrates is that often we have societal problems, but we can apply scientific methods like an experiment to understand what is the exact effect of social media. In the same way that we run clinical trials to understand whether a vaccine, like the COVID vaccine, is effective. We give the vaccine to some people and we give a placebo to others. In the same way, the people in this study received a treatment, which was getting a Facebook detox, and we compared them to the people who continued using Facebook. But so I'm happy to speak further about the questions that measure polarization, but it sort of aimed to track those two dimensions that we discussed earlier, affective polarization and ideological polarization.
Great, thank you very much for that very thoughtful answer. All right, next question, go ahead. We have time for a few more questions, guys, so think of which one. Go ahead. Is there a red line of no return, and how do we know when we've crossed it?
Well, I think the United States is very actively thinking about that question, so you are extremely timely in asking it. Is there a red line, a point of no return? I would say the answer is no, but that it's important to be aware that often polarization and polarizing actions have unintended consequences. So, for example, often politicians think, I'm not crossing a red line, I'm just engaging in this one polarizing action. So, for example, in the United States, the Democrats under President Obama eased a rule or changed a Senate rule that allowed them to appoint more judges to the national or federal judiciary. For the Republicans, this was crossing a line, and it actually precipitated what Americans see as now a very polarizing spiral of actions and reactions, where the Republicans then gained control of the Senate, and they changed another Senate that governed the appointment of judges to the Supreme Court. Now the Democrats feel that the Republicans have illegitimately engaged in appointments to the Supreme Court, and the Democrats are talking about procedures for potentially reforming and even adding new justices to the Supreme Court. And the Republicans are saying that would be totally a violation of democratic norms because it's illegitimate to add new judges or to add term limits onto the Supreme Court. And so what I hope this example illustrates is that often when politicians do cross lines, polarization can lead to an unintended tit-for-tat spiral of violating basic norms and crossing further lines. But to your specific question, I would say that there isn't necessarily a red line or a point of no return. And I'm going to return to the example that one of your classmates brought up of Kenya. So Kenya experienced brutal election violence after the 2007 election. Politicians on both sides of the divide, politicians questioned the results of the election. That led to election violence where more than 1,000 people lost their lives. And you could say, is that the point of no return? How can a country possibly come together after citizens have been in the streets and 1,000 people are dead? Well, the answer is that Kenya has invested seriously in strengthening its institutions. The Supreme Court, so Kenya's 2010 constitution, created a newly empowered Supreme Court. That court has now become an arbiter of election decisions. The court even ruled in 2017 that even though the sitting president claimed he had won re-election, the election was not fairly run, the election needed to be rerun against the wishes of the sitting president. So there is, to a certain extent, a point of no return in that polarizing actions can lead to further conflict, a tit-for-tat spiral. That is very difficult to pull back from. But even after countries have experienced the worst case scenario, election violence, that institutional break can sometimes be the peak of the fever that countries need to sober up and reform their institutions to combat and manage political polarization.
Thank you very much. Let's give a round of applause again. All right, I think we'll take 2 or 3 more questions. So put your hand up high if you have a question. All right, we'll take you, and you. All right, go ahead.
Thank you. Is there a right ethical amount of patronizing that a political member can use with good intention, or does it necessarily have to go in a bad way, like the United States, for example?
Sorry, would you say that again? An ethical amount of patronizing?
Yeah, that the political member can use with good intention for the country.
Interesting. So may I ask you, actually, it's a very interesting question, what you mean by patronizing?
Well,
Or polarization?
yeah, well, patronizing with the intention of polarization and creating like a group of members of the country with the same ideology, and then maybe form a group like the example you used for the voting, that maybe you could create a revolution.
That's fascinating. I think your question is a really great one because it speaks to this really interesting ethical trade-off that I was mentioning at the beginning between the fact that democracy needs a healthy amount of polarization, and also the argument that I was making earlier that polarization is often an intrinsic part, for example, in the US civil rights movement, of including new groups. So, for example, in the US civil rights movement, creating African Americans as a voting bloc, giving them the right to vote, was deeply polarized because the people in power in the US South were white and did not want to include a new group. So creating that ethnic group and giving it greater rights, increasing political competition, came with a very significant amount of polarization and even violence. So your question was, is there a right amount of polarization? And I actually think that's a great question for you all to debate amongst yourselves. What is the right approach and the right political strategy? However, I do think that your question indicates that often the correct ethical approach involves a trade-off between increasing ideological polarization and increasing affective polarization. So I think what we find especially ethically troubling in this comparative study of democracies globally is that a lot of the time what politicians are attempting to increase is affective polarization. So for example, if you listen to President Trump's response to his recent conviction, part of it is really vitriolic in the sense of trying to increase, or increasing in fact, affective polarization, making arguments that this was a political hit job organized by the Biden crime family, to quote President Trump's words, and that can be very dangerous insofar as it foments affective polarization. On the other hand, you might say that certain forms of increasing ideological polarization are ethical and really healthy in a democracy. So, for example, if you, in the United States, campaign on an issue like reducing the price of housing or something like that, that may be opening up a new ideological division in US politics, creating a new group, such as people who want more affordable housing, but it might not lead to affective polarization. So I think that it's actually an interesting normative question, philosophical question, because mobilizing people often involves creating new groups. How can we capture the benefits of having a healthy ideological division in politics without making that division a matter of social identity?
Thank you very much. Let's give a round of applause again. All right, penultimate question. Go ahead.
what would a world without polarization look like, and what would one with too much polarization look like? How far are we from both, and which one are we closer to?
Wow. I'll say briefly, I think that these questions have been fascinating, and I can tell that in many of them there are journal articles, academic articles, or even entire books that could be written on some of these questions. So I hope you guys will take that as an invitation if you have the chance to write college papers or even high school papers on topics of your own interest. So what would a world without political polarization look like? I think sort of it's hard to envision in a certain way because even in countries that are authoritarian, that do not have free and fair elections, there is still polarization. So I think that one argument that people who advocate for more closed authoritarian systems like Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping argue is these are systems without polarization. But I think that's a lie. And the reason I think that is that we've seen that in many countries, like Egypt during the Arab Spring, once the authoritarian government is removed, we actually see that the people have been very much divided by authoritarian. So even in systems where there is authoritarian control, where citizens aren't allowed to express their political divides, that doesn't mean the divides don't exist. It just means that often they've been repressed and even made worse by the existence of repression. So a world with too much polarization, I think, is one that I was describing where political divisions aren't just a matter of disagreeing over policy, but are instead a matter of social identity that have become deeply entrenched in our identities and that make it very difficult for citizens to vote for the other side. I think a world with too much polarization, especially, is dangerous for democracy in the following way. When polarization becomes severe in a world with too much polarization, it is very difficult for citizens to restrain and punish anti-democratic behavior by politicians from their own side. Because if the politician from your side engages in an anti-democratic action, you voting for the party is so intrinsic to your identity that you just can't bring yourself to switch to the other side. You might know that what your politician from your side is doing is not exactly correct, but you just can't bring yourself to vote for the other side, and that undermines a fundamental check to democracy. So a world with too much polarization is one in which politicians have a lot more freedom and flexibility to engage in violations of democratic norms because they know that the voters from their side are going to remain loyal. Unfortunately, I think that in many democracies around the world, and I'll put the United States in this category, we are dangerously close to a world with too much political polarization. And I think that it's an important question for you all to ask us about your own political communities. For example, in France, whether you see your democracy as one that could benefit from maybe more ideological openness, or whether you're instead seeing a pivot towards the extremes on the left and the right, and whether we're approaching instead a world with too much polarization.
Thank you very much. Give a round of applause. All right.
Hello, thank you very much for your wonderful talk. I was wondering if you believe that we are born with a biased opinion due to external influences, and if so, what can we do to go against that?
I think actually the social science literature is very clear on this, that we are born with a very fundamental bias towards groupish behavior. So, for example, many of you in the audience, this is France, so I'll say you guys may be football or soccer fans, but there's something deeply psychologically important for human beings about identity and participation in groups. This is why being a fan of a sports team is so much fun, because we become deeply psychologically attached to group, to our team, to the broader community that it represents. You might have a similar feeling about other groups that you are a part of, whether that's your school, when you find your high school playing against a competing high school. It might be your nation, when you see the French national soccer team winning a championship or playing against another team. So I think that there are deep psychological biases towards groups, and I think that that's one reason why the polarizing tactics of political leaders are so effective, is that they play on these very human biases towards group conflict, towards groupishness, that were highly effective from an evolutionary standpoint in encouraging human beings to build cooperative groups, to build tribes that could support one another. It's intrinsic in a certain way to family life, that we sort of have a certain amount of in-group attachment and favoritism towards people within our group. But I think what's very dangerous is that often these groups are being projected at a national level, and also that people are cultivating out-group antipathy, as we were sort of discussing in the earlier question about the ethical amount of polarization. These groups are being defined to decrease people's like and often increase hatred of alternative groups. Now, I'll just mention one really interesting study by, I believe, a French sociologist, Henri Tajfel. He did this experiment with high school students and elementary school students like yourself. And he randomly assigned students into groups, the red group, the blue group. This was totally arbitrary. And he found that even at respondents, the students in the group were much more willing to cooperate and have a favorable opinion of people who had been in their randomly assigned group. So to your point about biases and the challenges of overcoming them, perhaps the most human bias we have is to look after and to be part of groups.
Thank you very much. Give another round of applause, please. Now, a final question that I have for you, Andrew, is very simple. So could you tell us in, a sentence or two, what do you think us as young people, as students in high school, can do, should do, and will do to allow, polarization, but in a way that's peaceful, in a way that contributes positively to the world around us?
Well, Michael, thank you very much for organizing this conference first, let me say. And whenever the organizer of the conference says the question is going to be extremely simple, you know it's going to be devastatingly smart and challenging. I think that my advice, and closing advice, all of you, would be to think about creating your own identities. That what is so special about your generation is your capacity. You need to come up with ideas, and especially with identities, that are going to challenge and reshape your political system. That you may be born into countries that have narratives that pit one side against another, but you may see opportunities for a new narrative that synthesizes or maybe that breaks out of that binary. So young people like you are needed to create a new narrative on climate change, on the value of democracy, why democracy is so important, what your country's national identity will be, especially in countries like the United States and France that are increasingly multicultural, multi-ethnic, and diverse in a way that did not exist even 40 or 50 years ago. So I think my advice, Michael, to all of you about what you can and should do is not to be people who pick a side in the existing battle of narratives, who just rush in as combatants, but instead to take your opportunity as young people to think creatively about what you would like your identity to be, what causes you care about, and what new identities you and your friends can create.
Wow, big round of applause, guys. Thank you so much. All right. Listen, Andrew, thank you so much for your really amazing and very crystal clear, intervention here today. Your talk was, I think, very informative for all of us. I'd like to give a few words to finish off here, because I think that we heard a lot from Andrew today, which was very insightful. And as a student, I want to say a few things. I think there's one thing that we should all take into account today, and take into account every single ounce of amazing knowledge that we've heard, but also take into account that what we need to gain this knowledge. You see, in order to understand our world, the narratives, the polarization, you have to push through with that flame of curiosity. That's the well from which political leaders, from which researchers and experts draw their breakthroughs. When you only have one narrative, that's a form of totalitarianism. You see, it's like looking through a keyhole thinking you've seen the whole room. On the other hand, when you have multiple narratives that are in a balance, in an equilibrium, that is the modern guarantor of free speech, of democracy. You see, we need balance. It's a question of and, not or. Because narratives define who we are. The narratives you choose define who you will be. So I ask you this simple but not simple question, which is, who are you? Who do you want to be? What narratives are you going to choose? Today, now, we have this privilege to explore, to question, to carry on this fight for knowledge. Today, now, the path ahead may be long. Sure, it may be hard, but you should never forget that, at the end of the day, we choose the legacy that we leave behind in our world. Legacy, it's a nice word. It sounds nice, right? Well, what does a legacy mean for you guys? What do you think a legacy means? Yeah.
It's a trace that you leave in the world.
Absolutely. The trace that you leave. That's a very, succinct way to put it, which is perfect. In fact, there's this musical, Hamilton. Who's heard of Hamilton? I like Hamilton, right? Yeah, he says at some point, legacy, what is a legacy? It's planting seeds in a garden you never get to see. I think that's a nice way to put it here, because even though we may not get to see the big tree that comes of the seeds we sow, we should be happy in knowing that we've played our part in our legacy, in the legacy of the world. And there's this poet I like, and I think Harvard professor Longfellow. He says, when we depart, we leave behind us footprints on the sands of time, these traces. You see, so at the end of the day, you have to ask you, in this world with so much polarization, well, what footprints will you leave behind? We talked a lot about polarization today. We talked a lot about conflict. And if violence wins in the end in the world, well then, you and I may not get to leave any footprints at all. Today, now, because there is no later. There's only you and me and all of us here today, and what unites us and drives us forward. That flame of curiosity. There's this philosopher, Johann Goethe. He says, and I think I'll end with that, which is, mere curiosity adds wings to every step. Thank you. Oh, good, guys. Thank you. Michael, quickly. Yes. Yeah, why? I want to read. This is his books, man. Yes. Du magst I got that one, but there's more to it. YouTube looks...
C'est Naoru, je peux juste récupérer ma clé USB?
Michael, I think yes. We're so similar. Me and her are the same. Yeah, we're the same. I was just wondering, student learns from the master. I don't know. You're the one that I'm... Listen, join, man. Send me a message, email or something. I'll look at the website. That's it. I have for
Et merci beaucoup. Oh purée, c'était dangereux ça. Très dangereux ce que j'ai
Ouais, j'ai déjà fait ça. Miguel nous a ramené un trépied. Il y a un pélo, il te filmait, hein, tu sais.
C'est génial, merci beaucoup. Parfait. Ouais, bien sûr. Moi, je veux bien que tu m'envoies aussi.
C'est toi qui fera genre le bon académique.
Ouais. C'est moi qui pose. Ah bah, t'as pas vu la Polarization? Non, t'inquiète. Bah oui. Oui. Yes. Thank you so much. I appreciate it, man. Thanks a lot. But yeah.
Now people ask questions about your concept of So how do you actually convince them?
How to convince them? Well, it's stepping them a lot of we do a lot of what I call social crime. Social crime means you build a network. If you want, I can give you a big detailed thing, because like I have a whole plan.
Ashton, il veut faire une présentation de moi. Il fait un exposé à Sean. C'est quoi le dernier débat? Ashton, il fait un exposé à
I will bring that myself. Yeah, you know, I want to know
Sure. Listen, you know, I'll call me because right now I'm a bit busy, but call me and I'll let you know. Remind me, okay? Cool. Hey, great question, bro. The red line, that was concise and nice. Yeah. Okay, wait, let me just disconnect. Absolutely, bro. Thank you. Thank you for coming. It was great, man.
This one is still running. Cool.
Tu vois, la nurture, elle va à Harvard. Tu vois,
Like
Wait,
this.
who?
choisis les mêmes.
Chloe. Who?